Hello. Um, I'm Susan Weinstein. I'm co-executive director at Families for Depression Awareness, and I'm going to just take a minute to get started to give people a chance to get on and settle in and be comfortable. We're going to be here for about an hour and a half. So I hope you have a glass of water handy and that you've taken care of all of your various needs and children are settled down somewhere. I'm really thrilled to welcome you to our new, but hopefully everlasting webinar on adult depression, which is getting on the path to wellness as a family. At Families for Depression Awareness, we believe that caregivers, whether they're spouses or partners or parents or adult children, that you all have an active role in supporting a loved one living with depression. You're key players in family well-being as well as suicide prevention. So we believe that caregivers are really that essential player because they're going to notice when someone isn't well, they're going to be motivated to help them, and they're going to work to marshal the resources that they'll need to get on the path to wellness. So over the next 90 minutes or so, we'll give you a lot of information, and we're thrilled to be able to share insights and strategies about caregiving for adults with depression. And so hopefully you will be both inspired and equipped to help your loved ones through a depressive episode. We were founded in 2001, and our goals were to dispel stigma and provide information for family caregivers to be able to support their loved ones with depression or bipolar disorder. We want families to recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. When one person in a family has a mood disorder, it really affects everyone. And if you've experienced any depression in your family, you know that. It's not just the issue of genes where, your next generation may be, oh, for heaven's sakes. Well, there we go. So much for me putting on my headphones, I completely forgot. So that was Cosmo and Parker. Thank you for your indulgence. I'm so sorry about that. This is one of the things about working from home, right? But I think the next time we get around to a webinar, we'll be back in the office. So everyone in the family needs to have their needs identified and addressed. By now you visited our website, but you may not know it has a wealth of information. There are tools, there's lots of information from experts, from families. We want you to be inspired. We want you to feel equipped. And we want you to feel ready to take on the challenges of supporting your loved ones. So familyaware.org, dig deep because there's a lot there. But also, we're thrilled that sometime between now and the end of the year, we're going to be launching an entirely new look. So I want you to come back for that. Among the things we have on our website are the free online tests. We have a depression and bipolar test. We also have, excuse me while I'm doing this because I hear a dog coming.
We have our caregiver stress test, which is pretty new, and that you use to sort of gauge where you are with levels of stress, and it gives you some strategies and some readings to help you manage it. We were founded as a storytelling organization, and we've continued that. We're now in our 20th year. And so there are stories of people who have faced depression and bipolar disorder and gotten through it. And there are some stories of loss, but through all of it, there is the thread of hope, because we want you to know that there is a tomorrow, and that there are things you can do to help your loved one get there. We've also been doing webinars since 2010, unlike those of the organizations that hopped onto the webinar bandwagon when COVID-19 hit. We were able to pivot for some of our local programs, but we've been doing these. And so we've also been building out a library of resources. So we have webinars that cover teen depression, we have depression symptoms, we have bipolar disorder. There's a lot there. So take a look. We also have publications, including our brand new, you won't be able to see this because I'm sharing my screen, but Preventing Suicides, Stories of Loss and Hope. You can find these on our website. If you live in Massachusetts and you'd like to ask for Preventing Suicides brochure, let us know. You can send an email to info@familyaware.org. So we're going to go over some caregiver fundamentals. We'll be talking about adult depression and sort of where it is in context. We'll have fundamentals of depression and treatment. We'll be talking about supporting the family during episodes of depression. I just realized you could see me. So I'll show it. We'll cover some resources, and we'll have time for questions and answers. So if you haven't already submitted yours with your registration or you have others, drop them into the Q&A. And we will get to as many as we can. So we are thrilled that not only do we have a professional expert person, we also have a volunteer to speak from her experience as a caregiver. Meg is a person who looks on the bright side and sees the glass as half full. Her ability to provide genuine encouragement seems unending. When her husband Dallas was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety disorder in 2014 after the birth of their second son, she doubled down, believing that her positivity and prayers would be enough to pull the family through. She realized she was wrong. The journey was longer and harder than they anticipated, and it required more than her smiles and sweet sentiments. It required a whole team of doctors and friends and fellow group therapy participants, as well as the assistance of people already on the path to wellness. 7 years have passed since those dark times, and Dallas's days are now mostly bright as well. They've welcomed a third son into their family, and they currently reside in the greater St. Louis area, where Meg teaches yoga and enjoys volunteering with Families for Depression Awareness, for which we are grateful. We're also joined by our featured presenter, Christine Crawford. Dr. Crawford is the Associate Director of Medical Student Education in Psychiatry and an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine. She also serves as the Associate Medical Director for the National Alliance of Mental Illness. She completed her adult psychiatry residency and child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship training right around here at Massachusetts General Hospital and McLean Hospital. She received her medical degree from the University of Connecticut and her master's in public health at the Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Crawford has been engaged in community outreach initiatives through the Boys and Girls Club of Boston, the NAACP, and NAMI. She's authored multiple book chapters on mental health disparities and sociocultural issues in psychiatry, as well as peer-reviewed publications focusing on major depressive disorder. Dr. Crawford has made appearances on numerous media outlets and provides seminars on mental health and racism throughout our community. We are very grateful to have you all here. And at this point, I will be stepping back and turning it over to Dr. Crawford. Thank you so much. And just make sure you unmute. We can see you, but we can't yet hear you. And there you are.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that introduction. And I'm so happy to be here to talk about this important topic that touches so many lives. And the fact that you all are in attendance to learn about ways in which you can provide all the care and support that is needed for a loved one who is experiencing depression is so invaluable. And so I'm really happy that you all are here with us this evening. And so what I'd like to do is just start off from the beginning, describing who is a caregiver. And in a few slides, I'll also talk about some of the roles that a caregiver often finds themselves in. Now, when we think about a caregiver, it's someone who's in the person's life, who's experiencing depressive symptoms. And they often are a valuable resource because they can be the first ones to notice that there may be a change in the loved one's mood. They may be the first one to recognize the problem and bring it up to the person who's experiencing the mood-related symptoms. And for someone who is going through a major depressive episode, it may be difficult to have the wherewithal to find all the resources that you need in order to provide yourself with the treatment for the depressive episode. And so a caregiver is in a position in which they're able to look for all the different resources and assist the loved one who's experiencing depression with accessing those resources. And given that the fact that the caregiver is in a position to be able to intervene, especially early on, they can be the ones to actually take some of the first steps to action if the loved one isn't ready to undergo the process of receiving treatment for their illness. The important thing about being in the caregiver role is to have an understanding about the stress and potential burden that one can experience being in that role. Now, there have been studies that have demonstrated that about 40 to 70% of caregivers could actually experience symptoms of depression. In the same report that they did, they found that about a quarter to 50% of caregivers who were supporting individuals living with depression had a lot of stress and worries about their loved one. And some of the worries that attributed to their mood related symptoms on the caregiver's part were worried about the loved one's future, their ability to manage finances, and all of the stress that comes along with having to take on some of the responsibilities and tasks of the loved one who is unable to keep up with certain responsibilities. And so that can create a tremendous source of stress for the caregiver, especially when they're taking on additional tasks and when they're trying to get their loved one to engage in various activities that they used to engage in. That could be incredibly distressing when you're taking all of that onto your two shoulders. And you can imagine the tremendous relation strains in a relationship that can come along with that too, especially if you're taking on a lot of additional responsibilities. And we have seen that when it comes to spouses of individuals who are living with mood related symptoms like depression, if a spouse who's in a caregiver role perceives that being in that role is very stressful and it's very challenging, we've seen that there's an association between perceived levels of stress being in the caregiver's role and the severity of depressive symptoms that can be experienced by the spouse. And so there are some caregivers who are taking care of individuals with depression who can experience depression themselves. And if they perceive that role of being in the caregiver position as stressful, they're more likely to experience symptoms of depression and may need to find their own mental health practitioner to help alleviate some of those symptoms that they may be experiencing. Now, if you're in the caregiver's role, you're experiencing depression, and it's related to the loved one having depressive symptoms as well, that's an important thing to bring up in that person's treatment because it gives the mental health provider a greater sense as to how significant of an impact that person's depression is having on their social functioning, which is one area that we really look at when we're trying to determine the severity of a major depressive episode. So I know it's interesting that at the beginning of this talk, I'm starting off with talking about the caregiver's role. I'm going to talk about self-care. And one may wonder why that's even important to discuss. It's really important to examine the role of self-care at the very beginning, because if you aren't taking good care of yourself, then you won't have the capacity to be able to provide good support to someone else. You cannot pour from an empty cup. And so it's critical for people to find ways in which they can fill their cup back up so that they can give to others. You can't give to others if you have nothing to give. Okay. And on the right of the screen, you could see this image of the gas tank, right? You can't drive on an empty gas of tank. And so finding a way to commit yourself to self-care, finding ways in which you can recharge and re-energize, and that will look different for everyone. For some, it could be deep breathing. For some others, it could be exercise and yoga, meditation. And for some others, it could literally be reading a good book or binge watching your favorite show on Netflix or connecting with friends and loved ones. And so, whatever works for you, commit to that and make it a regular part of your daily routine so that you can be there when needed for your loved one who's experiencing depression. And it's all about finding that balance too. You don't want to spend too much time indulging in self care, so much so that you're not able to meet the needs of your loved one. So it's all about figuring out what the right balance is for you. The other thing when it comes to the caregiver's role, now we talked about the importance of filling up your cup so that you'll be able to meet the needs of the loved ones that you're taking care of. But it takes a lot of energy too, because there are a lot of things that someone tends to take on their plate when they're in the caregiver role. And so if someone is experiencing depression, I had mentioned earlier on that oftentimes the caregiver is the first person to be able to recognize and identify that there is a problem. And they may even do a lot of the research ahead of time, looking up what the different symptoms are of depression, looking up mental health providers who are in the area, various forms of treatment. So that takes up a lot of energy. And also, it can take up a lot of energy to advocate for the needs of your loved one when it comes to their mental health care. Because when people are experiencing depression, they may not have the motivation to advocate for themselves. They may not care whether or not they receive good treatment. They may not care if they get out of the episode, because that is a function of the disease process, is having limited insight and judgment and having a sense of hopelessness. So having the energy, the capacity to step in to that advocacy role to ensure that they're getting the good help and treatment is valuable, is incredibly important. Also, navigating the mental health system is really complicated and can be incredibly overwhelming. Trying to figure out which provider will cover certain treatment options or which insurance plans will cover various forms of medications. And so figuring all of that stuff out requires a lot of time and energy. And that's another thing that caregivers tend to put onto their plates. And I talked about finances too. Um, the medications, the various forms of treatment, the therapy. And unfortunately, when it comes to mental health, there are a number of providers that operate out of a cash only private practice. And so that requires additional resources, financial resources for families to be able to get their loved ones to be engaged in therapy. And you can imagine how stressful that is if you know that your loved one needs to be in regular individual therapy, because that is what is helpful for people who are experiencing depression and worrying about whether or not you can pay those bills, or worrying about whether or not you can pay for the medications in that month. It's so much stress, so many worries. And so that's another thing that caregivers tend to take on, and it can be a tremendous responsibility. Now, I think this would be an amazing time to hear from Meg, because I just described some of the responsibilities that a caregiver takes onto their plate, some of um, the stress that they may experience, and the importance of self-care as well. And so I'm going to turn it over to Meg, and I'm just going to pose this question first. As a caregiver, what have been the main ways that you were able to support your loved one?
Well, hi. I just want to say hello to everybody who's here. First of all, I want you to know how honored I am to be a part of this group, to be on this panel. It's precious, actually, to me to be here. And even though I can't physically see you, I can see you. I can feel you. I can feel your presence here with us. So just thank you for joining. My experience as a caregiver, first of all, my husband is who I will be referring to. His name is Dallas. I'm sure I will mention him often. I would say Dr. Crawford, Christine, hit it on the head in terms of the practical things. That would be the very first thing that I gave so much energy to just myself, because we are typically among the first to identify that there's a problem. And so I began recognizing, like, gosh, he's really sleeping in way more than he used to. He used to wake up an hour before work, and now he's like skipping out 15 minutes just in time to make the drive. And he's not even taking the meal that I packed for him. So just like noticing those things were wrong, identifying, but then what are those practical steps? And for me, it was researching providers, calling the insurance company, and fishing my way through that giant net of the healthcare system, which takes some diligence and it takes some resilience, honestly. I'm sure you've probably experienced if you're walking down this road. I would also say in terms of practical things, so there's the medical side of helping your loved one or your partner, whoever it may be, but there's also just the things among the house. Like in our household, Dallas was the dishes guy. He did the dishes every night while I did the baths and got the kids to bed. And pretty soon, Dallas was always in bed and the dishes were left in the sink. And at first I was like, what's up? Like, what's up with this guy? What's his problem? Like, pull your weight, buddy, right? But then as you start to notice that this is going on and there are more and more things that you begin to identify, at least for myself and in my experience, it was like, no, there's more going on here than just he can't do the dishes. Like, and so guess who did the dishes? I did the dishes, right? So just practical. You do the things that need to be done because they have to be done. And the person with depression is often unable or unmotivated, even incapable at times of just doing those practical things. So practical, number one. And then I think another important thing to touch on is to just simply be present with them in their pain. So I didn't get these moments with Dallas often, but when he was ready to open up or when something was heavy on his heart and he wanted to kind of unload or talk about it, set a timer for myself. Sorry about that. I made sure to give him my attention, right? So if I was in the middle of doing the dishes, I would stop doing the dishes and I would give him my full attention and really just try to be present and hold space with him when he was able to go to that vulnerable place. Because I think oftentimes there's just this numbness, there's a malaise. And so when he was ready to open up, to actually be there, right? To not be dismissive, I think is very important. So practical things, be present with them in their pain. And then I think another thing that I just want to encourage you guys in is don't take it personally, right? Like there was definitely a part of me that was like, what I do wrong? Like, I'm a great wife. Your kids are great. Your job, like, what's the problem here, buddy? And that is not it at all, right? So for me, I had to learn, like, this actually has nothing to do with me. I just happen to be on the same roller coaster ride, right? He's in this seat and I'm in this seat. And so we're going on this ride together. So how can I support him by doing those practical things and being present with him and take my personal offense out of the equation? No need to take it personal. I'll hand it back to you, Dr. Crawford.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you sharing all of that, because I imagine that, especially being a mother and needing to have the family unit run smoothly and bedtime and getting everyone ready to get out of the house, that having those sets of responsibilities on top of, the caregiver role of your husband and what it was that he was experiencing in terms of depression was quite significant. And one thing that I'll mention, I'm just going to transition back to the presentation, is that for a lot of women who are in the caregiver role, it can be tremendously stressful because oftentimes the way the family is set up, the mother often is automatically like assuming that role as the primary caregiver. And so there have been some studies that have found the significant burden that is on working mothers who are also trying to manage within the family. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I just want to put adult depression into context so that we have a better sense as to what it's all about and how it impacts people across the world. It's important to realize that depression, yes, it is a medical condition, it's a mental health condition, and it's a condition that can be experienced by anyone. No matter who you are, no matter what your profession is, no matter how much money you have, no matter how much money you don't have, it's still a condition that can be experienced by all. And as you see here on the screen, a number of influential people, a number of successful people here on the screen are all living and thriving with depression. And so the point of this slide is to demonstrate that it can happen to anyone. And there's also the hope that you can still, your loved one can certainly overcome the bump in the road that is the major depressive episode and be able to overcome that, especially with the help and support of you, the caregivers. They're able to live and lead successful, thriving, and productive lives. And so that's why that caregiver role is so critical and crucial, because anyone can experience this. And if they have the support and guidance that they need, they can also overcome it. Now, depression is a relatively common medical condition. In fact, 19 million adults in this country alone have experienced a major depressive episode. Just in 2019, 19 million in 2019 experienced depression. That's a lot. And some studies have found that at least 1 in 5 adults have experienced depression at some point in time. So, people in your family, your coworkers, people at the gym, at church, there is at least a handful of people that you encounter on a day-to-day basis who are experiencing depression. So just think about that. If you have a loved one who's experiencing depression, and I can imagine the sense of feeling alone in that, like feeling like you're the only family who's going through that. I hope that this can put things into a larger perspective to know that you are not alone in that there are 19 million other families who are going through the same thing. What is interesting about the figure that you see here on the left is that since 2005, looking at adults over the ages of 18, that there has been a slight increase, or there has been an increase in the number of adults who are experiencing major depressive episodes. And one thing I'd like to highlight that's particularly interesting, especially because I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I'm looking at our late adolescents here. But you can see that over the years, and the bottom here represents years, so 2005 to 2019, that you see this upward trend in the percent of folks who are experiencing major depressive episodes. And they say that the lifetime experience with depression for people in our country is between 10 to 21%. So as I mentioned earlier on, like 1 in 5, up to 1 in 5 adults are experiencing this. That's a lot of people and a lot of family members, a lot of caregivers who are part of that process too, and part of the roller coaster that Meg had described earlier on when it came to her husband, Dallas. So the other thing to put things into a broader context is the impact of COVID-19. we have talked about this ad nauseum about the mental health effects of the pandemic on adults and on children. And in fact, over the course of the pandemic, over the year, we have found a significant increase in rates of depression as well as anxiety, upwards to 30% increase in the number of people who are experiencing depressive symptoms. And it's no mystery as to why that's the case. Social distancing practices and feeling more isolated, not having access to all of the outlets that were previously helpful and improving one's mood were gone. Also, a number of people experienced tremendous loss, actually losing people from the illness and feeling a sense of hopelessness, and also the financial impact of that. A number of people lost their jobs. A number of people were forced to work from home while also managing, taking care of their kids who were doing remote learning, a tremendous amount of stress. And so caregivers were experiencing a lot of stress themselves. Loved ones with depression might have been experiencing more symptoms. And it was just a significant, it took a significant emotional toll on everyone, including our loved ones and caregivers. And what we are anticipating is this lingering effect of the pandemic and continuing to see elevated levels of mental health symptoms as we kind of return and reemerge back to what was normal. But it's a new sense of normal now, this post-pandemic era. And I've been really encouraged by the fact that the pandemic highlighted the importance of talking about mental health, talking about depression, because it seemed as though it was finally something that everyone was able to identify with, that everyone was able to have a better appreciation and understanding of what it is like to feel hopeless, of what it is like to feel overwhelmed and sad. And I think that made people slightly more empathic towards others who have mental health conditions. It made people more open and willing to discuss some symptoms that they might have been experiencing. And so I hope that is something that will continue, just these ongoing conversations about mental health, and hopefully a way to kind of normalize um, mental health conditions such as major depressive disorder. Now, I had mentioned that depression can affect anyone, and I had that slide of The Rock and Lady Gaga, all these famous people. Um, but what we have found, and a lot of studies have revealed, that rates of major depressive disorder, MDD, that you see on this slide, can be more common among certain groups. Some of those groups include women, people who have chronic illnesses, people who have chronic pain. And we know that um, it's not just a function of the medical illness that someone may be experiencing that is making someone feel sad, but there also appears to be some biological overlaps that make it such that when one is experiencing the stress of a medical illness, it can predispose some folks to depression, which I'll touch upon a little bit later on. People who have a history of trauma, as well as people who are in the when it comes to gender identity, they're in the minority, as well as people who are identified as sexual minorities, can also experience significant levels of depression. And it's not because there's something innate about a person who has a particular gender identity or sexual orientation, but it could be a function of some of the bullying that they might have experienced, or some of the trauma that they might have experienced that may have further contributed to some of their depressive symptoms. Also, when we look at people of color, including people who are part of the AAPI group, we see that rates of depression, that experiencing depressive symptoms can be a function of racism that people of color experience day in and day out, as well as the discrimination and the trauma that one can experience from the racism, the microaggressions, the prejudice, and how that can have a tremendous impact on one's psychological well being, and in turn can lead to depressive symptoms. And I just want to highlight the fact that it's not a function of one's particular race that is contributing to the depressive symptoms, but is a direct impact of racism that is contributing to the depression. So I want to kind of remove any biological association with being a person of color and having mental health symptoms. It's more of a function of racism experienced in this society. And I just want to highlight the fact that that is true because race is a social construct. And that's why it could happen. And I appreciate Susan in the chat providing some details about the abbreviations that are included on this slide. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Additionally, when we talk about the trauma that's been experienced by people of color, um, we see that people of color can endure ongoing trauma by all the various images that are portrayed in the media, whether that's in the news, whether that's on social media, especially when we're reflecting on George Floyd last year and constantly seeing videos of this man underneath the knee of a police officer. And a lot of Black people and brown people were seeing these images, thinking to themselves, well, that could have been me. That could have been my uncle. That could have been my brother. That could have been my dad. And this heightened sense of awareness, this sense of vulnerability, certainly takes a toll on one's emotional well being. And so, again, just the violent imagery further contributes to some stress that people can experience that can lead to some symptoms of depression. And we know too that thinking about the military population and being in the military service and the tremendous toll that that can have on someone's emotional well-being and the psychosocial burden that that can create on a person who actually was deployed. But it's not only the impact that it had on the person who was in the military, who was deployed, but also on their spouses and their children. And so they might have also been impacted in a way such that they might have experienced more depression and anxiety. The thing about depression and the reason why I was attracted to the field of psychiatry, the reason why I've always been interested in major depressive disorder is because so many people experience it. And unfortunately, so many people experience their symptoms alone, experience their symptoms thinking that there's absolutely no way out, experience their symptoms thinking that nothing can be done. But the reality is that there is treatment that is available. And when people receive treatment for the depression, whether that is with medications alone or being engaged in a form of therapy or doing both, and doing both is kind of the best way to go. There's a lot of evidence doing both therapy as well as medication. We can see that people can experience relief from their depressive symptoms and they can actually get better, and it can shorten the duration in which they're in the middle of a major depressive episode. And treatment can also reduce the frequency at which one experiences major depressive episodes throughout their life. Um, and if medication and therapy doesn't work for some people, there are other options, other treatment options that are widely available for folks. And so if one form of treatment doesn't work, it doesn't mean, oh, well, I put my hands in the air and that's it. No, there's lots of different options. And so this is a role that the caregiver can take on in the way in which they support their loved one. Because it can be quite frustrating when people are trying different forms of treatment for depression and things aren't working, to have the caregiver step in and say, well, I know that you tried this one medication. It didn't give us the response that we were hoping for. But I wonder if we can see about other options. I wonder if we can look into booking another appointment. Or I wonder if, given that therapy session, it didn't seem like it was a good fit with that particular provider. How about we can look for another therapist? And so being in the role of the caregiver allows you to come alongside the individual, the loved one who has depression, and help them see the light at the end of the tunnel, to be able to hold and carry the hope for them that they may not be able to see and carry. And you are in that role to help them move forward through their treatment. If it's not working, to bring them to the next step and to carry that hope that they can get better. And it's just a matter of finding the right fit. Oftentimes when it comes to depression, people can think to themselves, well, if I could just will myself through this, if I could just simply think positively, if I could go to church and pray on it, then I could get better. But and all of those things are really important and incredibly helpful. And at the same time, one could experience ongoing symptoms, more severe symptoms, despite their best efforts to take matters into their own hands. And so I think it's really important for people to realize that delaying treatment doesn't help, that you can do all of those things, exercising, talking to your spiritual leaders, and you can talk to your primary care doctor, you can talk to a mental health provider at the same time. The reason why we encourage people not to delay treatment is that the more you delay getting into care, the more severe the symptoms may be at the time in which you engage in treatment. And the symptoms may be so severe that you may need more intensive supports. If you delay treatments, not only are the symptoms more severe, but you increase the likelihood that it may be more difficult to actually treat that episode, that it may be more difficult to find the right medication to reduce some of the symptoms. Um, and also, if you delay treatment and your loved one isn't getting the help that they need for depression, it may make it quite challenging for them to be able to manage some medical conditions that they already have. If they aren't, if they're feeling hopeless about the future, or they don't really see that they need to get help because they don't want to be a burden to anyone else, it may make it more difficult for them to take care of their physical self and be able to address some of their underlying medical issues. Um, and delaying treatment, it gets in the way of functioning. It gets in the way of being able to have meaningful relationships with friends and family, to engage in work, and to feel like they're back to their usual self. And lastly, what I'll say about delaying treatment is that I'd already touched upon the fact that you can have more severe symptoms, that the duration of the episode could last longer, but also it can potentially increase the likelihood of having additional episodes. So increasing the frequency at which one experiences depressive episodes. So, being in that caregiver role, if you notice something, you're starting to notice these changes, and you brought awareness to your loved one about it, it's so important to have the conversation about ways to get the person to get into help. Now, I'm just going to expand upon some basic things regarding depression. And before we get into that, I think this would be a really great opportunity to hear from Meg once again. When it comes to Dallas, I'm really curious as to what depression looked like for Dallas, and when you were taking care of Dallas during those episodes.
Sure. Well, it was not a pretty time. I mean, it was very heavy for sure. And I would say it was kind of a slow spiral into that deep, dark place, is how we like to refer to it. He was always jovial and lively and charismatic, and, just like any number of people that have all of these amazing qualities. It was almost like one by one, all those amazing qualities were going into hiding, like they were retreating. I didn't ever see those aspects of who he was in that regard anymore. One of my favorite ways to describe it is that I would just look at him, look in his eyes, and he would not even be there. Like at the worst of the worst, when we were really in the bad place, it was like, who are you? I didn't even recognize the person in front of me anymore. And that is a really scary feeling, to be like, you're unidentifiable to me right now. That's a little bit frightening, to stand in the presence of someone that you love and you care for so deeply, and to not recognize them. So I definitely experienced that. And I would say, while Dallas was aware that he wasn't himself, it was also like, whatever, like, that's fine. That lack of motivation was definitely a through line, I would say, in his experience and in our experience. So just general cloudy, general heavy, general grayness. But also then there would be outbursts from time to time that were huge and emotional and very angry or very rage filled, and honestly a little frightening as well at times, because this was not something that I had ever seen from him before, and so it seemed out of character. It didn't seem to fit who I knew him to be. So I would say lots of gray, and then big moments that were not actually high moments, that were very, very low moments, unrecognizable to me.
Absolutely. And not being able to recognize your husband, I can imagine how terrifying that was. And also can imagine that it really prompted you to give him the help that he needs, because
For sure.
you want to continue to see him like that. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yes.
So now, the thing about depression, and I'm sure that being in the caregiver role, some of you all have already done some of this research, and I appreciate that you're here tonight to learn a little bit more. But there are many different causes that can contribute to depression. The reality is we don't really know what is the one thing that causes depression. Various factors can contribute to it, whether that's what's traits that run in the family, various neurotransmitters in the brain that may have various levels, and low levels can contribute to depression, whether it's a history of having trauma, experiencing stressful events, especially chronic stress starting from a young age, if that increases the likelihood of depression, or having really serious illness. There's so many things that can contribute to depression. It's multifactorial. And when we talk about depression, I've been referring to major depressive disorder, also known as MDD, and that's a very common form of depression, but there's other types too that you might have already heard about. Commonly heard about is postpartum depression, also referred to as perinatal depression. There's treatment-resistant depression, and that basically is a form of depression in which one is not responsive to medication, and a number of different medication trials have been tried in the particular patient. There's also a condition referred to as dysthymia, which is a chronic form of depression in which the symptoms aren't as severe as, say, as in a major depressive disorder. And then also there's a bipolar disorder, which requires different treatment, and using the antidepressants that we typically use for major depressive disorder is not indicated. Actually, it can result in some significant symptoms. And then also, I talked about the overlap of having some chronic medical conditions and depression, but some of the overlap that we see in chronic medical conditions and depression have to do with heart disease, diabetes, as well as individuals who may have a substance use disorder. We do see the overlap between that and having depression. So, what does depression look like? And I think Meg did a great job highlighting this when she described some of the things that she noticed in Dallas when he started to become more symptomatic. What we see is that for a lot of people, it can feel as though their brain is in a fog. It's really difficult for them to focus, to concentrate. They may be quite indecisive, and it's hard for them to get things done. Things that they would usually be able to complete with no problem at all take so much more time and a lot more mental energy. People also feel as though it takes so much physical energy to get up and to get moving. It's almost as though you're walking in mud or that you have cinder blocks attached to your feet. And so this get up and go to work, get up and shower can feel so, so difficult. And I like what FFDA has used, this ROAM kind of acronym that stands for Reasoning, Organization, Attention, and Memory. Gives you a better sense as to the cognitive impact that depression can have on someone. And I recommend that everyone checks out the ROAM model over at familyaware.org. So it's more than just being sad and crying a lot. There are a lot of other symptoms that come along with depression. So, a major depressive episode, one needs to have various symptoms at least for 2 consecutive weeks. And so, a lot of people don't realize it's just 2 weeks that you need to have these symptoms in order to meet criteria for depression. That's right. It's not 2 months, it's not 6 months, it's just 2 weeks. So, if you see your loved one experiencing changes in their sleep patterns, in their appetite, concentration, as I mentioned before, it's difficult for them to get up and move around. If they're feeling hopeless or guilty about things that they've done in the past, feeling like a burden to other people. And if they have a lot of random physical complaints like headaches, stomach aches, really non-specific pains. And lastly, if they have thoughts about suicide, thoughts about not wanting to be alive, and it's getting in the way of their day-to-day function, that is a major depressive episode. Now, we talked about motivation earlier on. Meg had highlighted this when she talked about Dallas. When someone isn't motivated to look for a mental health provider, to go to see their therapist, go to work, that it's not that they're just being lazy. It's a function of the condition of the depression. And so that's why it's so important for a caregiver to step in and to help when it comes to the person navigating the mental health system, whether that is finding the provider, going to the appointment with the loved one, sharing their medical history, the family history, helping them to evaluate different treatment options, and then also providing feedback to the loved one about what seems to work from their end in terms of some observations that they've noticed, and what may not be working. And they can also assist with adherence to the treatment plan as well. And so it talked about the caregiver being able to recognize, to be able to know what depression looks like and sounds like for their particular loved one. And once you have a sense of so what it looks like for your loved one, with now having this knowledge about depression in general, can really make it a lot easier for the person experiencing depression to have a little bit more insight and awareness about their own condition, and to be able to talk to their friends or other people within their support networks, and share with them, hey, I wonder, have you noticed some changes in these various domains? My spouse, my friend, my partner have noticed these things. I wonder if you've noticed these things as well. And so just receiving feedback from a number of different resources can be incredibly supportive for that loved one and helpful for the person who's navigating depression. So in terms of treatment option, it's not a one size fits all model. And that pertains to medications and various forms of therapy. And so for some people, just being in talk therapy alone works. And for some people, just taking medication is sufficient enough. But we do know that the two together, therapy as well as medication, is the most important. And so, as a caregiver, one of the roles that you can play is helping the person to make a decision around their treatment, and not to make the decision for them, but help to make the decision with them. And so that you can be aligned with their concerns and as well as their goals. Um, the other thing as well is that when it comes to the initial evaluation that they may have with a mental health provider, there are a number of things that take place during that initial assessment or the evaluation. Speaking from the lens of a psychiatrist, there could be blood work that's associated with the evaluation for coming in to check out about some depressive symptoms. They may opt to do a physical exam, and that's because there are a number of medical conditions that can present with some symptoms of depression. So, medical conditions like hypothyroidism, in particular, can result in some depressive symptoms. So, they just want to rule out any underlying medical issues. The family history, and also getting a better sense about the social history of the individual, what they do for work, who they are as a person, so they can get a more holistic view of the patient rather than just looking at their symptoms. And then some evaluations include a cognitive evaluation, because as I described earlier, depression can really have an impact on your cognition. And so they just want to make sure that there isn't an underlying different type of cognitive impairment that may be contributing to the presentation. As a loved one, what you can do, especially if you have someone who's a little apprehensive to talking about their depressive symptoms, a little apprehensive to seeking out treatment, is perhaps you can encourage them to fill out this online screening tool that is available through FFDA. And you could see the website there. And as a caregiver, you can also go through some of those questions just so you have a better understanding of what some of the symptoms are for depression. Talking to the primary care doctor is so important too. And so, if your loved one is going to see their primary care doctor, you can share with them, well, I know that you took that online screening tool I had recommended. Thank you so much for going on that website. How about you discuss some of the findings from that screening with your primary care doctor? Perhaps there's a way in which they can help. And then also, I just want to highlight the resource that is 211, and you can call it on your phone, and that can also give you some access to some local resources for mental health. Now, there are a number of things that you can do in the caregiver's role when it comes to getting help. One thing that you could do is you can help to narrow down potential providers for the individual. It's not helpful to just hand the loved one this long, lengthy list of different providers in their area. That could be incredibly overwhelming. It's not enough to tell your loved one, oh, well, I guess you should just call the number on the back of your insurance card. There's a section that says behavioral health. That can be overwhelming too. Waiting on the phone, having to talk to the person on the other end. It's a lot. So helping to narrow down the options, helping to make phone calls, have a narrow list of various options can be incredibly helpful, especially for someone with depression who's being indecisive, who's having difficulty kind of thinking through all these different steps. Now, when it comes to finding help, there's a tremendous amount of resources. FFDA has a lot of resources on their page, which has already been described before. But on the right of this screen, you can see a number of different websites that also have resources for finding providers that may meet some of the unique needs of your loved one. Community health centers can also provide treatment. A lot of people don't realize that schools, if you have an adult who's in college. Also, various organizations have employee assistance programs, also known as EAP, that provide counseling and mental health supports. There are also a number of providers who are now available and more willing to do telemental health. That's all we've been doing for the last 15 months, including myself, seeing people over the computer or on the phone. And so if making the trip in person may be too much for the individual who has depression, perhaps finding someone who is able to offer virtual services could be one way to navigate that. And thinking about our spiritual communities as well. What a tremendous resource that provides counseling. And so that can also be another support that can be added on to the person's treatment. Now, there are a number of different providers who are able to provide treatment for mental health, for depression. MD such as myself, there are nurse practitioners and social workers. A lot of people don't realize that when it comes to seeing a therapist for the various forms of therapy that you see on the right, which have evidence in treating depressive symptoms, um, you don't have to stick with the first therapist that your loved one lands with. People feel like they have to continue therapy with that person. They may not feel as though they're able to establish a good rapport with them, or they may not connect with them for a variety of different reasons. If it doesn't work, it's okay to leave that therapist and to find another person. And it's about finding a good fit too. We want to make sure that the loved one feels comfortable with their therapist, feel comfortable being vulnerable and open and willing to discuss really difficult things with regards to their depressive symptoms. So if it doesn't work out, as a caregiver, you can help them find someone else. Now, talking about medication, um, antidepressants are really helpful for treating depression. And the most common form of antidepressants that we use are known as SSRIs, which stands for serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Really, really fancy medical name for medications that help to increase and boost serotonin levels, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain that helps people feel more relaxed, less anxious, and feel less depressed. Um, and I recommend that people not shy away from the medication at a concern about cost, because a lot of the antidepressants are available in generic forms and are available at very low cost. And so, if for whatever reason you're having difficulty, your loved one's having difficulty paying for medication, especially brand name medications, this website right here, rxassist.org, can provide some resources for that as well. Now, caregivers can help to provide support to the loved one who has depression about being able to monitor some of the side effects that can come up with some of our medications. And so, some side effects that caregivers can be really helpful in detecting are things like irritability. I didn't mention this earlier on when I talked about some of the symptoms of depression and 2 weeks and some of the diagnostic criteria for that. Now, in addition to being depressed, we can also have irritable mood as a symptom of depression. And so if you notice that someone is more irritable or even more anxious while they're on a medication, that's feedback you could give to the loved one, so that perhaps there can be a change in their medication. And also to encourage them to continue to take it, to remind them to take it, because for a lot of people, it can be hard for them to remember. And antidepressants, it's not like a light switch where you start taking it and you feel better within a matter of hours or days. These medications take weeks to work. And so being in that supportive role and reminding them that things will get better, it's just a matter of time, can be really helpful for that person. I just want to touch briefly about additional treatments that are a little bit more intensive than traditional forms of treatment, including therapy as well as the antidepressant. If someone needs a higher level of care, there are programs called intensive outpatient programs, which meet with people who have depression several times a week for a couple of hours at a time, and they provide more intensive individual therapy and group therapy for the person with depression. And also there's a psychiatric prescriber who can monitor their symptoms on the medication. And then if the symptoms progress to a point in which they're unable to take care of themselves because of the depression, or there's a safety issue with regards to having thoughts of suicide, then inpatient level of care is what's indicated. An inpatient level of care is basically going to a hospital where there's a psychiatric unit. Fancy pants forms of treatment that are really effective, and I just want to highlight ECT is a form of treatment that stands for electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as shock therapy, that has been around for years and years and years, but it has changed in modern times such that it is painless, that people don't have significant side effects from it, although there are some cognitive side effects like memory impairment that people can have, that especially people with treatment-resistant depression can experience a whole bunch of relief from undergoing ECT. TMS is a newer form of therapy that uses magnetic stimulation to help boost the mood and various neurotransmitters. And vagus nerve stimulation, it requires a surgery in which they put an electrode in your brain and you're able to provide various releases of electrical stimulation to help with the way that the brain you know, functions and helps to improve mood and cognition. And most in recent years, and you may have seen this already in the media, is that there's been a lot of conversation about ketamine, and there are some IV medications in the form of a steroid that can actually be used to treat postpartum depression. So those are newer forms of treatment, the ketamine and the IV medicine for postpartum. But that just goes to show that our field is continually trying to look for new medications and new forms of treatment. Insurance. Now, that can be a big thing when it comes to especially more intensive levels of care for and treatment for depression. And so I recommend that people go to the Family Aware website. There's a whole list of resources when it comes to navigating the insurance issue, especially if you are having to pay out of pocket, your insurance company isn't reimbursing for an inpatient stay or various form of treatment. To be able to look into this website for some resources on how best to navigate that. Now, if people don't have insurance, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that some mental health providers have sliding scales available. So if you're not able to pay the full fee for individual therapy, for example, they may have a conversation with you about what it is that you can afford based on your income. So I do want to highlight the fact that sliding scales are commonly available in a number of mental health outpatient clinics. Also, the community health centers have behavioral health clinicians who are able to provide support. Schools also have counseling services as well. And so I highlighted earlier on about all the different websites in which one can find a provider, as well as rxassist.org if there are any issues in terms of paying for medications. If one has any safety concerns, and what I mean by safety concerns is having worries that the loved one has thoughts about harming themselves in any way, you always want to check in with their mental health provider. Call the emergency 911 if there is an acute safety issue. Certainly call 911. And also there's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and the number is displayed here, that you can call to get some support and guidance around that. And so if there's an imminent risk that the person is at risk of harming themselves, certainly do not hesitate to call 911. You can also call the police to do a wellness check on your loved one if you haven't heard from them in a while and you're worried that they might have done something just given the severity of their depressive symptoms. But if there doesn't seem to be any immediate danger, you can have a conversation with your loved one on how best to move forward. So again, a tremendous amount of resources available. These slides will be available on the website as well as this webinar. So you always will have access to go back and look up all of these different resources. So what I like to do is transition back to Meg, because I think talking to Meg is really helpful because it just puts everything into perspective, because someone who's been through it, who's lived through it. And I just wanted to bring Meg back because I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about what it was like for you as a caregiver, to touch upon a number of things that I covered in this talk. So the first thing that I was curious to hear from you, Meg, was how did you engage in self-care? How did you practice self-care, especially when Dallas was experiencing depressive symptoms?
Oh, what a great question. I actually found yoga during that time.
Mm.
And it's something I had always poo-pooed, because if I was going to get a workout, I wanted to sweat and I wanted to lift weights and run hard and fast. And I was not going to go sit in a room and breathe for an hour. There's just nothing I was ever going to do. And a friend invited me, and I tell you what, I was hooked, because during that time, carrying so much, it's a heavy weight on yourself, right? And it was an hour just for me in a quiet space, without anybody else needing me, with no interruption, with no distraction. And that became just almost like my weekly sanctuary, like, oh my gosh, yoga's in 2 days. I can make it 2 more days, and then I get my hour reset. So that became for me a non-negotiable. I had to have it.
And I think it's really interesting how mentioning about yoga and thinking at first, oh, it's not for me, but you gave it a try. And clearly it's something that's been incredibly helpful for you. And so I'm also curious too, I can imagine that when Dallas wasn't able to keep up with things such as doing the dishes or trying to help out with bedtime, I can imagine that the set of expectations that you had for your family and what your family could do while Dallas was experiencing depressive symptoms certainly changes. And so I'm curious to hear from you about how it is that you guys kind of renegotiated some of the expectations that you had for your family in the midst of his episodes.
Sure. I would honestly say there wasn't much communication between the two of us about the kids in that regard. It was not almost, I was protective. I was protective of the kids. Not that they weren't still around and that he didn't kiss them goodnight and whatever, but I didn't I didn't want them to see the big outbursts. I didn't want them to encounter the rage moments. I didn't want them to always be asking why daddy's asleep again on Saturday afternoon instead of going to the park with us. So I almost, instead of letting the children's focus be here, I intentionally was like, we're just going to focus here instead. We're going to go to the park. We're going to have a great time. So I just found myself being extra, for lack of a better word, just extra hands on deck, extra activities, extra things to do, almost as a bit of a distraction technique, I would say, where the kids were concerned, because it was a little bit of like eggshell walking, you know? And even as we began the treatment process and as he started on medication, you touched so well on the point that it takes a while before they affect the person taking them. And even then, we personally, in our experience, we went through 3 different trial and errors of medication. And one of them in particular, it got really dark. It was all of a sudden the suicidal thoughts. And I was concerned with self-harm. And I had to learn to actually give myself permission to actually ask Dallas, like, are you thinking about harming yourself? Which was like a light bulb for me. You know, I didn't realize that that was a question that you could ask, but I think it's an important question to ask. Yes. So all of that to say, it's a very uncertain time. And so I think I did my best to keep the children's focus over here, and while navigating what was happening with Dallas over here, and just being able to balance, like, okay, we have found the right medication now, and let's begin to talk about reentry. Maybe this Saturday you will go with us to the park. Maybe we'll do that thing we've been talking about doing, as we began to see him climb back up out of that well.
And that's a lot to balance too,
Mm.
protecting the children, being mindful of Dallas's symptoms, and also kind of the worry about how he's responding to the medication, and if he's still having scary thoughts about harming himself. That's a lot. And so I wonder, what supports did you have? Did you have extended family or any other supports that you were able to talk to about some of Dallas's symptoms?
Great question. And the answer is no. Um, I had supports. This is something, so like contrasting then and now, right? So then, while we were in the midst of it, I was just in survival mode. So I did whatever I needed to do to get through that day, and then wake up again and rinse and repeat, just get through. So aside from my 1-hour yoga class, everything else just went just shove that down, right? Well, turns out when Dallas started receiving therapy and treatment and was on the proper medication and things started going much better for him, I had a deep breath and realized, you know what, Meg, I think maybe it's time for you to, point the fingers back at yourself and go to counseling, go to therapy, and address some of these things that happen and the burden of what it was like. Which I did. And one of the questions that my therapist asked me was, Meg, you had this support system in place in terms of practical things. You had people and friends who would pick up the kids from school if you needed it, or who were bringing a meal when you had a baby, or babysitting help, like those kinds of practical things. Why didn't you tell them? Like, why didn't you let them know? And not that people didn't know Dallas was depressed and in therapy, but I never uncovered him. And I think that was just a protective mechanism as well, because he was a little bit embarrassed. As he was going through it, he wasn't ready to talk about the dirt yet. When you're in the dirt isn't always the best place to talk about the dirt. I'm a firm believer of talking about the dirt, but I think sometimes you have to learn the lessons in that place. And so once he was learning the lessons of that place, then it was time for me to go back and examine all the dirt that was on me that I was still carrying around. And so part of that was, why didn't I? And another part of it was, I during that season, I couldn't do much for me, right? There wasn't that time to be introspective. It was the rinse and repeat, like I said before. But even as Dallas now is many, many miles from the dirty hole, in many ways, I still looked at him as if he was in that dirty hole. And I still walked on eggshells and was like, well, you just never know. You never know. And so one of the other things my therapist has worked with me on is learning how to take him out of that box, how to take him out of that place. Like, he's done the work, he's gone through the process. So I don't want to keep him there. And so that's been a big learning process as well, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate the fact, Meg, that you talked about how therapy was helpful for you,
Mm,
because you really took on a lot on your two shoulders when it came to Dallas's depression, and wanting to protect him too. And that's why you were hiding some of the symptoms he was experiencing from other people. But hiding that and keeping that all to yourself
yeah.
really can weigh you down. And it
Yeah,
could be really difficult to carry that with you day in and day out. So I really appreciate you highlighting some of those things. So
definitely.
thank you, Meg. I'm going to transition back to the presentation with just one last slide that I would like to share with you all as we wrap up and transition to the Q&A section, is that you are not alone. It is so important to get connected. And that's what FFDA is all about. That's why we're here. And that's why Meg is sharing her story as well, so that you know that you are not alone in experiencing the stress that can come along with being in the caregiver role. So I encourage you all to take advantage of all your supports, your social supports, the faith communities, just so that you don't feel isolated and alone in this. So with that said, I'm going to toss the baton over to Susan to wrap up our presentation.
Well, I'm here somewhere. Uh, wow, you guys, that was so much to cover. And I really appreciate your persistence in conveying all that information. I'm going to try and figure out how to share my screen again, but we'll see. Do I do it this way or do I do it that way? You'd think somebody would really know by now. But I'll just keep talking in the meantime. Actually, Dr. Crawford, are you able to throw your screen back on and I can just talk through it if you advance the slides? Beautiful. So you're not alone is what Dr. Crawford was just saying. There are some resources. You'll find these when you print out the handouts. So then the next slide is that one of the tools that we have available is a family action plan. And it helps families really get together, decide what needs to be done, choose like the top thing that they need to work on, set out how to do it, and set deadlines, and then convene back together and get on to the next thing. So it's a great organizational tool and motivational too. The next thing is that we have a ton of resources on our website. As I've mentioned, you've already seen a lot of these as we've gone through. And so explore our website. One thing I do want to raise here is the stages of change. Someone actually asked, what if people don't take your encouragement, basically? And I think that you can get some answers on that from the stages of change, because just because you're ready for them to do something doesn't mean they are. And then on the next slide, we have a chance for you to get a couple of our brochures for free. If you would please give us your feedback, let us know what we've done well, what we can improve, what you learned. The link is there. I think we're also going to send it out tomorrow, but it's really important to us to get your feedback. And as our thank you for your taking the time to do that, which is not a whole lot of time, I hope, we'd be glad to send you these brochures. And then I want to thank our funders. We are very fortunate to have corporate members who support our organization as a whole. And those include GeneSight, Sage Therapeutics, Janssen Neuroscience, and Takeda. We also have program sponsors specific to our adult depression program, and those include the Takeda Lundbeck Alliance, Janssen Neuroscience, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. I'd also like to thank our presenters and Dr. Crawford and Meg. You guys have been incredibly generous with your time and your experience. I also want to thank staff members Ari and Jessica for being on the back end here and helping things move along. And just a little shout out to my son, because my monitor died just before the program and he came to the rescue with his. I also want to thank you all. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's good for us to know that this content is needed. We know that this is a kind of funny topic that people are going to get to when they need it. And so we're really thrilled that we've been able to present it and keep it on our website. So if you ever need a refresher or you know people who would benefit, send them over, it will be there. If this was valuable to you at all, certainly appreciate you supporting our work and making a tax-deductible donation at familyaware.org/donate. With regard to questions, I do want to say that some people submitted ahead of time, and we're grateful for that. If you want to come back on screen, Megan and Dr. Crawford, that'd be great. Meg, do you have any advice for someone who really can't get away from taking it personally?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's hard. It just simply takes practice. And I would say the first thing is just to recognize, like, oh, I took this in, I internalized it. Why did I do that? Okay, it's hitting this in me. I'm going to let that go. You know, I think recognize it first, like, ooh, this hit me in a bad way. How can I dissociate it from myself, right? How can I place it over here instead of in here, which is only going to come by practicing it, I believe.
And I kind of think the flip part of that is to recognize that it's not really the person who's saying this, it's their depression speaking. And then that can help you to move it aside and just try to remember who that person is that you know, and have the hope that they will get to being back to a person that you can know and feel good about supporting, rather than feeling like they're diminishing or attacking you.
Very good.
Thank you. Hipaa. Someone asked about Hipaa, which is sometimes a barrier to families being involved in their loved one's care. Dr. Crawford, do you have any suggestions for working with their loved one in order to have access?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. What a lot of people don't realize when it comes to Hipaa is that you can still call your loved one's mental health provider and express any concerns that you may have about the individual. The provider can't share information with you, but you will be providing an incredible service by sharing with that provider any concerning symptoms that may be coming up. You can share with them if there's concerns about treatment non-adherence, and that can be important information for the provider, such that when they go to see the loved one or the patient again, they can navigate that conversation or be a little bit more in tune with that because the loved one was able to provide that information. So it can be really frustrating when you're on the other end and perhaps your loved one had severe symptoms and they're in the emergency room or in the hospital and you're not getting any information about what's going on. Just keep in mind that providing information and resources to the treatment team is incredible. And so still do that, even if you feel as though you're like iced out of the treatment planning.
And I would say a couple other things are your loved one can sign a consent form so that their providers can talk with you. So don't forget that you know, if you're supporting them, then it might make sense for them to include you. Also, if you're participating in the appointments and you're part of shared decision making, then it's pretty implicit that you're part of it, and that you've that the person living with depression has waived that privacy stake. Damn, I have one more thing. There was one more thing and it's slipped my mind, but we have information about Hipaa on our website. Oh, the other thing is, don't wait until there's an emergency. Ahead of time, you make a plan. And if you put it in writing, and we have some stuff about advanced planning on our website too, and that can really alleviate a lot of the problems as if your loved one gets into crisis. Someone has a parent, someone living with depression has a parent who just doesn't get it about depression. Do you have any suggestions for how they might have that conversation? Yeah, send them to this video.
Yes, and I think kind of understanding that you may not be able to convince your parents about the significance and severity of the condition, that despite your best efforts, you may not be able to get them to fully understand and appreciate what it's like to live with depression. But what you can do is find ways to engage with them in a way in which they can provide you support in other ways. So if they can't understand depression, you can say to them, well, I'm unable to take care of my kids, or I'm unable to financially do this. Are there ways in which you can help me from a very practical standpoint? Because basically I can't do these things. What can you do for me? And parents, for some, if they are being told or being asked by their child that they need some support and it's very practical, it's something that the parent feels like they can actually do, then perhaps you can make some headway. For a lot of parents, they can feel powerless if their child is experiencing depression because they don't understand it. Why are you depressed? Everything is going well. And it can make them feel like they might have failed on their part, and that might be incredibly painful for the parent to bear. And so just being really concrete and practical about what it is that you need from the parent, then maybe you can get some support in other ways, rather than just simply trying to convince them that depression is real.
And here's one that's been asked in a couple of different ways. What if both you and your spouse live with depression?
Meg?
Meg. How can you manage that?
That's a toughie. I think you need outside support and resources as well. Because if you're both experiencing a depressive episode at the same time and you have children who are young, especially, I can imagine that it would be near impossible to balance that. And so I think you would have to have lifelines outside, which probably would involve hard conversations, messy conversations, and to be able to send a text, hey, we're having one of those moments. We really need support and we really need it like ASAP. I think that would be my best advice.
I wonder if couples therapy would help at all in trying to, yeah. But at least that's a place where, there's someone who can help moderate some of that.
Absolutely. And there are some forms of therapy, specifically CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in which they have various tools and strategies to help kind of navigate some of the feelings of depression and hopelessness. And so I wonder if each could kind of help reinforce some of those principles and say, hey, that sounded like you're doing that black and white thinking again. Hey, it sounds like, you're having these thoughts and that's why you're behaving in this sort of way. And so it may be hard to do that when both are in the midst of a major depressive episode, but if both are in treatment, then they have an awareness of some of the tools and strategies that can be helpful, and they can help reinforce those for each other if one is struggling.
And one of the things that we really wanted to also get across is family wellness. And for both of you, are there, at Families for Depression Awareness, we put stock in something we call SEAM, which is sleep, exercise, something else, eating right, and mindfulness. And we see those as sort of the basic building blocks. Are there other things that you might suggest for family wellness? We often say is, take a look at what works for self-care and see what might work for your family. Do you have some experience with that, Meg?
I do have just a practical tip. Something Dallas and I do every week is on Sunday night, we just kind of sit down and we look at the week ahead and we look at the calendar and who has appointments and when does Dallas work out? When is he going to get in his exercise? And I would like to definitely highlight that as well, because that has been imperative to his well-being, to his mindset, to his recovery. And in fact, if there are times when a week goes by, 2 weeks go by that he hasn't made it to the gym, that's a surefire way that a trigger could flare up more so than before. So exercise is so important. So in our little Sunday night meeting, we hit on the schedule. We hit on when is Dallas going to exercise? When is Meg going to exercise? When is Dallas going to do the thing that fills Dallas? Like whatever that is, whatever he needs to fill him up. When is Meg going to do that? We work it into the family calendar. And then when are we going to have intentional time as a family, just all together? That's our intentional time. So it's just a practical way to have that touch point that has really helped us. And often, Sunday night goes by and we're well into Monday and we go, oh, we didn't do it, And so then as soon as we can, we're like, we need to make a plan. We didn't make the plan. So don't worry, it takes a while to form new habits.
And the other thing too that a family can do is kind of model how it is they manage stress, anxiety, and sadness, and talk about it and have open conversations about how it is that they're coping. And I think that could be a great way to model to children how to maintain emotional wellness. And so just having as many conversations about how you're feeling and your emotions can also be a great way to maintain family wellness.
How can parents talk to their kids about one of them having depression?
Meg, I'm like looking at you now.
I mean, mine are, we're so young during the worst of it. That to be honest with you, it's not like we've gone back and sat them down and been like, well, for a while your daddy was really depressed. But I would say when questions did arise, like, why is dad taking a nap again? Like, why is he not going to the park? My response would be, he's sick. He's sad today. He's not feeling well. Or if it was because of the medication, I would just respond as honestly as I could in a manner that was age appropriate. They were young. I probably would respond with some more specifics now, if that were still the case. So I think it's important to cater it to the age of the child, and also not to hide it. Kids know, they sense what's going on. And if you're not telling them the truth, I think they would sense it. But I also don't think they need to know that daddy was having thoughts of self-harm. And so keep it age appropriate.
And I just want to piggyback off of that, because everything Meg said is spot on, making sure that it's age appropriate. And also, it's important to talk about what actually is going on rather than trying to sweep it under the rug, because especially for young kids, they could be really egocentric and they may think to themselves, oh, daddy or mommy, they're acting differently. It might be because they don't like me, or is there something I did wrong? And so in order to prevent that from happening, it's important to be somewhat forthcoming about what's going on. But like Meg said, you don't have to go into all of the nitty-gritty details about what is happening.
And for us, when it's a teenager, we see it as an opportunity to start a conversation about mental health and about how to ask for help, and how to see if something's, if you see something's wrong with a friend of yours or something like that. All right, last question. How do I put all my trust in medical providers when I feel like I'm not being kept informed? Over to you, Dr. Crawford.
Well, I'm saddened to hear that one doesn't feel like they've been well informed by their provider. And one of the reasons why I am in medical education and I teach medical students how to become great doctors, whether they're going to psychiatry or not, is talking to them about the importance of communication. It is incredibly basic. And it's not just about what is being communicated and the content, is how and it's the way in which it is communicated and shared. And so if you're not creating an environment that's welcoming, you're not creating an environment that you're relaying information in a way that's easy to digest, then the person isn't going to feel well connected and the message isn't going to resonate with them. So it might be that people are providing the information, but it's not being communicated in an effective way. And so it's so important for patients who are on that end to provide that feedback to their doctor, or to have a caregiver or another support system in the room to provide them with that feedback. Because we as medical providers, we're here to provide you with care. And if we're not meeting your needs and we're not addressing your concerns, then we're not providing good care. And so finding ways to provide that feedback is hard, but it is important. And so if you need to bring someone else on board to do that for you, I highly recommend it. But I'm so sorry to hear that it's been a challenge.
That's great. And I would also just say that the whole concept of shared decision-making is that the decision-making is shared. And so what should be happening is that your provider should be telling you what the alternatives are. And you should be saying, well, the thing that's important to me, or the things that are important to my loved one are that they not gain weight, or that they're able to have a regular sleep schedule, or whatever their priorities are. You want to be able to articulate those, and you want the provider to say, okay, well, if we're going to have that consideration, then these are the things that we should look at. Just like, if you're getting medication and price is an issue, let your doctor know that, because for almost everything, there are alternatives, right? So I would just say that, work on having that communication with the provider, and have the communication between the caregiver and the person living with depression, so that you can be a team in advocating for the things that will help your loved one to get well and to feel invested in their own care. So I'm a big thumbs up on that one. All right. Well, we have reached our time. I am ever so grateful to the two of you for spending this time with us, and to all of you who are watching this. Please do remember to give us the feedback. The link is in the, let's call it the chat. And if you don't have the chat, it's https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/capital, all caps, FFDA 2021 AD. I hope you all have a pleasant rest of your evening or day, or whenever it is that you're happening to watch this. Come to familyware.org. We have lots and lots and lots of information for you, so that you can be the effective caregiver that you want to be, and be the support that your loved one needs. Thank you all very much.